Good evening. My name is Monique Constance, and this is my response for Portfolio 1. I begin first with my research insights, the 12 research insights. The first is talking about school kids investigating language. It is important for students to investigate their use of cultural language as a means to reaffirm their identities within the classroom. I cannot say that this is new as I incorporate the study and use of Black dialect in my secondary ELA classes. However, I appreciate the insight as to how this works for Spanish-speaking students who are a new demographic of student for me this year. The text notes, quote, the valorization of translanguaging practices and using these to sustain her identity in a community setting of most Spanish dominant adults. So the idea that students can investigate the way that they interact in their relationship with language is really, really important. I do that with my students, particularly because they are from New Orleans, which has its own uh, linguistic dialect. And so getting them to see the way that they use language and how that translates into a secondary ELA classroom. Next, we have our community-based accountability, which I think is a huge issue in urban education, in where we question the lines of, how do we hold families accountable? Here, it is noted that there is a need for, quote, balancing academic, linguistic, and cultural interests, which will then require accountability to Indigenous communities. This gives insight into the ways in which educators can create relationships of care and cultural affirmations, which inherently creates a buy-in of sorts of community and familial accountability and participation. I also think that, relationship building definitely is super, super important. If families feel as though you care, they will be more willing sometimes to support you in the ways that you need to as an educator. We then have student-centered approaches. As educators, we must create space for our students to be active participants in their learning, and this begins with understanding the racialized, economic, gendered, etc. gaps in schools. This is in alignment with the personhood of the student, wherein teaching, quote, teaching methods were born out of necessity, a response to being ignored, neglected, and at times maligned within school. I definitely think this is important when we talk about understanding how the American educational system is undergirded by racism and colonialization, stepping away and rejecting the individual nature of whiteness, and coming back to the communal sense of learning and understanding that we see naturally occur in communities of color. Next, we have teaching Native languages to students, which I really, really was interested in. The Native American Community Academy, also known as NACA, incorporates Native American language courses into their pedagogy as a means of cultural affirmation and literacy purposes. I am an educator whose thoughts are focused on the education of Black students. So this research really made me question the impact of teaching Black students languages and dialects of the African diaspora and how this may impact their self-perception and literacy, as well as their self-efficacy. The book notes that teaching Native languages, quote, is a culturally sustaining and revitalizing practice. I agree with this, and so I wonder, in the American school system, what does that look like for predominantly Black schools? Are we going to teach them African languages, or do we expose them to other dialects of English, so other forms of patois um, that are relevant to how they acquire and speak English? And will this help them understand the methodology of spoken and written word? We next have the truth space integration, which is the integration of truth spaces allows for students and teachers to use narrative as a means of learning. This allows students to reflect on their own personal journeys and to affirm and hear the journeys of others. Quote, this highlights the importance of creating greater fertile spaces between storytellers and story hearers where our lives can be shared. I also think this is very important. In my classroom, I often, pretty much every day, just even asking the question, how are you doing? Or have you ever done this? I think it was Toni Morrison or even maybe Bell Hooks, who talks about an engaged classroom and where the teacher is also the learner. And so I love being able to learn from my students through their personal narrative, encouraging them to tell their stories, because for me, most of our stories are tied to sociopolitics. And so you can learn greater things by learning your own story and recognizing your own story, and then bearing witness to the stories of others. Um, the next is social justice components. Educators who integrate social justice literature and lessons in their ELA classes can initiate what the research called critical action, wherein teachers are encouraging and influencing their students to move, quote, move their learning beyond the classroom towards social action. So if we talk about issues of social justice within the classroom, if we are reading literature that is written in the face or about social justice, how can I then tie this into a larger lesson that will then make students think about how this relates to their own world? It's a kind of in the premise of each one teach one. And I definitely think that ELA classes and social studies classes in particular are the perfect ground for that to occur. My last three research insights would be literacy through linguistic sustainment, the integration of allowing students to respond in a natural and culturally linguistic manner during class rather than as an extracurricular activity. There's an example of spoken word in the classroom and the need to allow it as an educational space rather than an after school experience. The culture of the student must be a part of the educational space. So if our students rap, I have a whole bunch of students who are rappers, right? They want to be rappers, and I allow them to do so, freestyling Fridays, and just talking about dissecting why they like their favorite rappers and looking at the art of hip hop and the art of rapping as literature, and allowing them to do so without reprimanding them, giving them instructional minutes within the classroom space to relate their nuanced linguistics into the class is really important. It's affirming, it opens them up, and it allows you to teach them, because once you get them excited, then they're more open to receive. Um, Next, we have writing as resistance, which allows students to use their cultural linguistics is an act, allowing students to use their cultural linguistics is an act of academic and socio-political resistance, and counters students' rejection of writing within their classroom. So their resistance to writing is a way to safeguard themselves from the negative gaze they receive from teachers and peers. Affirming their cultural linguistics may mitigate the initial resistance, also allowing them to write about things that are not necessarily academic, allowing them to journal, allowing them if they're in their feelings. I always have a corner when we were in classrooms that had a poster that said, in order to heal, you must write what you feel. So you feel like beating that girl up today? Okay, go write about it. Go write about it, and then let's come talk about it. And I think that is also writing as resistance, because it lets them see that you can use writing as a tool of personal expression and not just the colonial kind of route way that we force students to write and respond, especially in English classrooms. And then lastly, I again looked at the School Kids Investigating Language in Life and Society program, which I touched on earlier, but this now talks about the particular tenets of the program, which strives to support cultural linguistic practices, facilitate access to the language of the institutionally powerful, and to skillfully criticize social inequity, which are all components of CSP. I especially liked the idea of facilitating access to the language of the institutionally powerful. How, yes, it is important to affirm cultural linguistics, but how do we then give our students the tools to translate their natural language into language that they need for, in some cases, survival? That's really, really important, I think, in all of this is we are giving them both worlds, the critical and the creative aspects, but all of it ties into survival. Okay, then we have culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogy, or CSRP. This pedagogy speaks of the need for teachers to understand the socio-historical aspects of schooling, particularly in regard for the assimilative methods of schooling for Native American students. This pedagogy is important for all students as a means to address socialized conditioning and correct it through cultural affirmation and learning. Quote, colonial schooling has been the crucible in which these contested desires have been molding, in ways that they have separated their identities from their languages, lands, and worldviews. I don't, this is so important. It is, I want my students to always be aware of who they are, whose they are, where they come from. I always, I tell them this is not just an English class. This is a way for you to use communication and language to protect yourself and to protect your lineage. So the CSRP is something I hold very, very near and dear when it comes to instructional and curricular practices. Next, we have collaborative language immersion teaching. If a school decides to teach in a language other than the colonized or dominized language, it is good instructional practice to allow for collaborative planning and co-teaching, which, quote, strengthens teachers' language abilities. I also agree with this. I teach at International High School in New Orleans, and I, in the department, as the department chair, am the only English teacher who speaks Spanish. And so I think about what changes my other teachers could see in their classrooms if they had the tools and the ability to approach their curricular instructional planning from a bilingual aspect. And what do I need to do to make that happen? And how would that impact data and just the self-confidence of our ELL learners? And then lastly, in addressing monolingual standardized testing, there could be a hesitancy to implement CSRP into schools and classrooms because such practices are not deemed as intellectually stimulating enough for standardized testing standards, which I do not agree with. However, proper preparation and seeing CSRP as worthwhile helps to mitigate such concerns. Quote, teachers and administrators create a curriculum that integrates Native perspective through these and other courses while attending to state standards. And I can attest to this. I have, throughout my 4 years of teaching, have created a Black-focused literary studies curriculum and, garnered my school, the school I worked at for 3 years, garnered them the first passing AP language and composition scores for the first time in 10 years through culturally affirming literary studies curriculum. So you can do well on standardized testing. Learning and talking about people of color is intellectually stimulating. And when it affirms the student who's reading about the experiences of people who look like them, it allows them to see the opportunities and just the expansion that can happen when they open their minds and really theorize who they are and what that looks like in all instances of things that they come into contact with, educationally, personally, socially, politically, economically, in all of these regards. So my first three reflective insights is one, as an educator of predominantly Black students, my focus has always been creating secondary ELA strategies for their benefit. This exercise makes me reflect of how I need to become more inclusive in my instructional goals and planning. Two, I am at a new school with a large Latinx population. Many are undocumented and are new English language learners. I am fluent in Spanish and in tune with the sociopolitics of that demographic, but I have not been as intentional as I could be in planning a creative and inclusive classroom. Bilingual instruction is not enough. The research presented included detailings of Native American schools and approaches to that pedagogy. It made me realize that I do not think of that demographic. I really do not think intentionally think about Indigenous students. In comparative thought, I am also interested in learning more about the ways in which colonization has impacted their learning, in contrast to the way colonization and slavery has for the African continent and its diaspora. Four, the narrative about the unwilling writers is personal to me as a secondary ELA educator. You always get a student who's like, I hate writing, I hate reading, I'm not going to do it. But I always make them do it. And that is a part of my instructional behavior. It's because I understand students who immediately resist literacy out of fear, embarrassment, or just sheer defiance. And the fun part to me is finding the cracks and drawing them in without having had a name for it in my first years of teaching. It is nice to know there are theoretical practices that undergird my approach to teaching, reading, and writing. The openness to Black culture has always been a part of my instructional behavior. Five, reading research about the connection between cultural relevance and responsiveness in regard to language and literacies of students of color is very important to me, and the reason I have sought a master's in curriculum and instruction. It is important to me to impact and revolutionize the canon in secondary ELA classrooms of predominantly Black and non-white students, and even white students. But my focus is catching Black students up when it comes to literacy. And then lastly, I'm interested in the translinguistic nature of Black dialect and the institutional use of English. It makes me want to research how using ELL language acquisition skills could possibly work for English speakers who are fluent in cultural dialects. My three reflexive insights. First is, I don't know everything. I think I'd like to think that I know everything. And I think that that is an arrogance of a lot of, I put Black teachers, but I also feel most teachers who feel as though they are resisting and rewriting the educational world. That is the arrogance of those who see themselves as revolutionary. And I am not immune to this. This research humbled me and reminded me that I am in my infantile stage of curricular and instructional development. Two, my focus on the education of Black students is exclusionary and bordering biased. I question how much I have to adjust in this regard, and particularly if I am to continue teaching mostly Black kids, what am I teaching them about other cultures and experiences? It makes me think of my first semester ever teaching. I fell into teaching. I did not go to school to become a teacher, and I taught Spanish for one semester and, made sure that my students knew that there were Black people who spoke Spanish, which was new for them. And so just thinking even in that regard of expanding everything at the canon outside of just an American focused and a Black focused perspective. And then lastly, as a teacher leader, I question how to best teach CSRP practices to white instructors. As I seek to expand my career in instructional coaching, it is important that I become less rigid and less skeptical of non-teachers of color. Um, Teaching Black, Brown, and Indigenous students. That's just, I have to be very honest about that and reflexive about it. Do I trust white people to teach our children? You know, I don't know. That's definitely something that I'll probably be very reflexive on as this course continues. And my self-grading rationale, I give myself 120 out of 120 as I have thoroughly engaged with the content as well as questioned myself throughout reading, particularly as an instructor who views themselves to be culturally responsive by nature. And that is my response to Portfolio 1. I hope you have a wonderful day and a good evening. See you later.